Good morning, everyone. This is Steve Schaff, and today you are viewing the RCI Community Capital live stream, where each week we bring you all sorts of good topics and introduce you to all sorts of good people who are working on common goals, such as ours, to help create stronger communities by raising community capital and anything else that helps create a more just and economically equal world. So today we are very lucky and fortunate to have with us someone who's done some really great work. Marc Carr is with the Ashoka Foundation. He's an experienced philanthropic leader with 10 plus years of global experience in social enterprise and innovation. He believes in the philosophy of thinking globally, acting locally. I love that term, with expertise in various philanthropic domains such as business development, partnership, management, strategic leadership, programs, communication, team management, and incubating new initiatives and systems. His role with Ashoka is as Director of Venture and Partnerships. So this is something that, of course, is of interest to us. Working with various sources of capital and expertise is part of our RCI Community Funds approach to community development. So with that in mind, Marc, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work with Ashoka, or just how you got into this and why we're here today talking about our common agendas.
Yeah, well, Steve, thank you for that great introduction. It's hard to follow up after that. I think you did a really good job of introducing
Hey,
you.
man, you earned it. And those were your words,
Well, I can add
which I know
that.
are.
Yeah. Again, I just mentioned this to you a few minutes ago, but it's kind of hard sometimes for me to focus because I've done so much. But let's just start with the Ashoka. I've been with the organization for 7 years now, and during my time at Ashoka, my portfolio has been at some points global and at some points domestic. I just sort of came off of a global portfolio where I was training and providing capacity building opportunities to social entrepreneurs from around the world, specifically in our markets in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and Latin America, to be more specific, Mexico. And and what I should also mention about Ashoka is that the sweet spot for us, as far as, or the way we define social entrepreneurs, I should say, is those who are creating deep and lasting systems change. So they're not just addressing the sort of surface of the problem, and there's nothing wrong with addressing the surface of the problem. We just like to really focus on and support those who are addressing the underlying root causes of any social inequity, inequality. And so I led this global portfolio, a lot of capacity building. Um, Currently, my focus is domestic. And this is where I'm leading a special project that's focused on racial, economic, and environmental justice in the American South. And that project started in March of this year with the 2,000 plus mile tour where I drove from my home here in Baltimore all the way through to Northwest Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas. Came back up through the Midwest. I'm originally from St. Louis. So since I was in Arkansas, the neighboring state, I couldn't help but go home and came back to Maryland. And on that tour, I learned so much. One of the key things we learned is that there's so much abundant change making talent in the American South that's often overlooked. When we talk about the South, we usually talk about all of the bad things, right? And we overlook the good things happening in places like Clarksdale, Mississippi, known as the home of the blues. But there's so many great projects for community redevelopment led by proximate leaders, those who are closest to the problem. That's giving one example, but we saw that throughout the South. I experienced Charlotte. Sorry, yeah. What's the city in North Carolina? Why is it Durham and Charlotte? These places in North Carolina as epicenters of Black entrepreneurship. For instance, New Orleans is sort of a power base of community organizing. I can go on and on and on, so I want to rein myself back. But that was sort of the kickoff of that special initiative. And now the next phase is helping to shift philanthropic resources to better support what's happening in the South, because we know that less than 3% of philanthropic dollars nationally flow to the South, and only a fraction of that flows to proximate communities. And so when we say proximate, we're talking about Black people, we're talking about Indigenous people, and other people who have been marginalized due to systemic racism. So let me pause there because I get excited and I can just go on, but I'm going to rein myself back.
Well, I have a whole bunch of questions, and then I'd like to for Bill to kind of type out his expertise and his focus on kind of penetrating and supporting the kinds of communities that you and your foundation are looking to really serve. So some of the questions I have is, so you did a tour throughout the South. You were obviously, I guess, looking for or getting a sense of the needs out there. Is that something typical a foundation would do? Have their folks literally go in and do that kind of tour to get a sense of what's really needed?
I would say that it's not typical.
Hmm.
And I should also mention that Ashoka isn't a foundation per se. We do provide some funding to some of our fellows, but we're not a foundation. And for this work, we have partnered with the Nathan Cummings Foundation. They are based. It's a New York-based foundation led by Ray Ramsey, who Black man, entrepreneur. So he's sort of, very familiar with some of these communities, who said, hey, like, we want to do something in the South. They're getting ready to do a big play in the South. But we are a New York-based foundation. Ray Ramsey is from Washington, D.C., which is technically the South according to the Census Bureau, but culturally is a little bit more East Coast. It's a global city. So he said, hey, despite my identity, despite some of my experience, there's still a lot for me to learn, and we would be remiss if we didn't actually do our homework. Ashoka was very aligned with that approach. We have fellows in the South. We're building a very extensive network in the South. So we said, hey, that's a great idea. We have folks that are in the South. Let's get on the road. Let's go talk to them. And we're talking about people like Tim Lampkin, who's based in Clarksdale, Mississippi. His organization, Higher Purpose Co., is supporting a network of entrepreneurs in the Mississippi Delta who are often overlooked when it comes to capital flows. We have people like Aisha Nyandaro in Jackson, Mississippi, who has the longest running guaranteed income program for low income Black mothers in the country, founded in 2018. And from the data, we find that when you give Black women in low income communities like Jackson an extra $1,000 per month, they do all of the right things, defying the stereotypes. They are supporting their families and children. They're buying homes. They're starting businesses. And so we said, hey, this is a great opportunity to learn from what's already working. And what they told us about what's needed is better support and sort of more equitable relationships where people aren't treating them like, children, to be frank. So yeah, let me
Hmm.
stop there.
That's a very good point, because a lot of foundations come in and they kind of are paternal and often kind of miss the real players in the communities. So that's very interesting. You mentioned Jackson, Mississippi, which is probably one of the most disinvested communities. It's kind of a showpiece, a community as to where $1,000 or various small investments could really make a difference. So it's, I think, a real testament that you are literally in these communities, kind of scoping out, seeing what's going on there. And that's part of our approach too. Is we are a social enterprise ourselves, and our goal is, to make reasonable returns on our money. But the social agenda is very, very important, at least in my entire career, as well as our colleagues here. So Bill would be his part of our collaborative here would be to work, identify opportunities in communities like this, and then Bill, with his crowdfunding expertise, would really help with the kind of the micro in terms of help raising capital or investments for some of the these smaller distressed or I guess forgotten kind of opportunities out there. So again, it's a testament to your organization to put you out there to really find out what's going on. One of the things that you mentioned the Cummings Foundation. So, and thanks for the correction. Ashoka is a social enterprise, focuses on social enterprise. They do provide some capital, but for the last 40 years or so, you've been building an infrastructure of bringing this expertise, the organizers, the business people, and a collection of people. So it's no surprise you found a home in Ashoka based on what I know of your background. So what's the relationship you have with Cummings, and how does that relate to your 2,000-mile tour, which I hope you got reimbursed by mileage?
Well, that last comment is a good sort of segue because the Cummings Foundation funded that trip. So yeah, they funded the trip. It's really been our relationship actually started at the Skoll World Forum. I think that
Mm-hmm.
was 2023 when our director, and I'm talking about the director of our U.S. team because again, Ashoka is global, and I think an easy way to describe us is the world's largest community of social entrepreneurs with over
Mm-hmm.
4,000 fellows in over 93 countries. At any rate, in the U.S., our director was attending the Skoll World Forum where he met Ray Ramsey by chance. I think they were sort of like sitting next to each other at one of the sort of events there. And Ray is very energetic. He's very opinionated, and he was speaking with our director about all of the things that needed to change around our educational systems and other systems in need of repair. And so that sort of kicked off that relationship, and I was brought into their conversation as a proximate leader because the frame from which I am leading this work is a frame that is really attempting to get to the root causes of inequality in America, particularly in parts of the South, but throughout the country, which is what I describe as racial caste. And when I say racial caste, what I mean is a certain branding of a certain group of people who were enslaved and their descendants. And so, we're still dealing with the vestige of slavery, and that has its hardest impacts, obviously, on those whose ancestors were enslaved in this country. And it's reflected in all of our systems, from the criminal justice system, from our financial system, from the educational system. We see all of these stark disparities, the racial wealth gap being a prominent one. And specifically, when you disaggregate the data and when you look specifically at those who descend from the formerly enslaved, that's where you see the biggest gaps. And so I started to kind of, go on my whole little riff like I'm doing right now with Ray Ramsey. We were just vibing, and he was like, "Yeah, that sounds, great. We're a foundation that's committed to racial justice. They're a Jewish family foundation, so their focus is on racial justice in the United States and in Israel, Palestine. And in the United States, Ray mentioned that, obviously, it makes a lot of sense to start in the South because this is where the data is showing us we have some of the deepest disparities, particularly in places like the Mississippi Delta. So that kind of kicked off the conversation. And to make a long story short, I think um, the vibe, comes from this alignment in values, this ideal that you don't tell groups what they need, but you go and learn from them because they know. And I think this is something that the innovators we spoke to in the South really appreciated because they were very quickly, able to call out the fact that they are the experts. They're doing great work with limited resources. They're able to overcome that. And despite all of that resilience, all of that tenacity, and all of the relative success, they're still overlooked and undervalued. And so having those values or leading with those values of just really focusing on equity and dealing with people in equitable terms is, I think, what really makes our relationship with the Nathan Cummings Foundation work.
Mm-hmm. So, was the result of your tour? What I guess I should say, what are the results of the tour? Have you? I think you wrote a study, submitted to them. What's the outcomes, or what are the possibilities that could come out of that? That would be concrete and real and impactful in the community, some of the communities you've identified.
That's a great question, Steve. We're still grappling, like we're still figuring out what to do with all of the information. It was a 30-page report that focused on specific trends in the South. So one of the main trends we saw, for instance, was all of these redevelopment projects that were tapping into the history of the region, but building
Mhm.
upon that for more equitable development. So let me use an example. There's a development project in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the Paramount Theater. The Paramount Theater is in the heart of Clarksdale, which is a really cool town, by the way. It's in the heart of Clarksdale. Um, and in the back, and so the Giro Arts Incorporated is a nonprofit organization that wants to repurpose that theater into a creative space where folks from the community, including low income folks, can come and get space to be creative, and they will provide the community with other resources like classes, et cetera, et cetera. Now the thing is, in the back of that theater, there is a fire escape, sort of like the fire escapes you see or you envision when you think of New York City, those and this is a pretty old building. So there's this fire
Yeah.
escape, which was the coloreds only entrance during the Jim Crow era. And so their approach to redeveloping the site is saying, hey, there are still people alive that remember this. So we can't create this space and invite the community without recognizing that. And so as they redevelop the space, they're going to contextualize their color only entrance and just sort of make it, this is a part of their inclusive development perspective. That's just one example, and that's a very specific example, but we saw different iterations of that. I'll use another example, Anasa Troutman from the Big We in Memphis. She's redeveloping Claiborne Temple. Claiborne Temple was the site of the 1968 sanitation strike that led to the assassination of Dr. King. She's
Mhm.
redeveloping that site to contextualize that history, but also to provide the community with classes to train them for restorative economics and collaborative business creation. So it's sort of an incubator as well as a cultural anchor that's meant to restore value to the people, to say, hey, like this is all of the great history you have right in your backyard. And to say, hey, leaning on that history, you can be a part of the future by re-envisioning and redeveloping your own community. And there's a lot of moving pieces. I'm just giving you the high level sort of overview. But all of that to
Mhm.
say, we found all of these great insights. And to answer your question, we are still, taking those trends and saying, how can philanthropy show up better and really fund these organizations and all of the great work that's happening in a more equitable way? And what that looks like, what we're beginning to shape is a participatory grant making approach where we bring those proximate leaders, we sort of, and funders, we design the themes of this fund, and there's a certain shift in power from the funders to the proximate leaders to make direct decisions with little barriers as to who gets funded in the South based on the wisdom of the proximate leadership. So that's just one approach. There are other approaches, but let me stop there because I think that was a lot that I shared, and I don't want to, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Bill, any questions from you about, in particular, the Memphis project, because that's kind of a type of project we'd like to look at. Someone who's really taking initiatives, plugged into the community, but is doing more than just doing a one-off restoration of a building. But it seems like, based on your description, it's going to be education, it's going to be culture, it's going to be community cohesive empowerment exercise, and probably a bunch of other things that can go into there. And that's kind of what our focus is when we go into community. How can we make the broadest impact that creates long-term change? So, Bill, in a case like this, which I know you have a lot of experience in helping capital together for usually small, undercapitalized businesses, um, uh, give me an idea of what how this example is the type of opportunities we're looking for, or the type of collaborators and communities that we're looking for, and how we can help bring capital to these kind of efforts, which require a lot of collaboration and coordination.
Sure.
So, in other words,
First, let me let me pull out a little bit with the lens.
I tend to ask
You
very
guys talk for 20 minutes and then
tangent questions.
you ask me one very specific question. Uh, there was a lot said,
Yeah.
a lot. So I would say that the first thing that when I think about community capital, how community capital works, is initially looking at the community for the capital. One of the things that I am a strong believer in is that people say, well, the money's not there, they don't have the money, but these communities, they exist already. People eat, people do everything that they need to do to survive as human beings. So some of the dollars that are being spent could potentially be invested in these types of projects. Starting on the ground with the people is really important, and I really like that focus because the people I used to say this when I was a community organizer, people who live the problem, right? They're the solution. I messed that completely up, but something to that effect, right? Those who live the problem are the solution. I'll get it figured out. But and I truly believe that. From someone who's an outside observer, doesn't really know what is needed in the community. I think having the community take an active role from the beginning in the planning, in the organizing, being able to tell people what it is that they want, what that should look like potentially, and then working out from there is the way that crowdfunding and community capital work. If you're not able to get people to buy into the shared vision, it's not necessarily going to work. Even if you're able to get outside capital to come in, if the people do not buy into that vision, why would they support it? And I think that's something that's often overlooked. I worked on a project, and the so we were working on it from a community capital perspective, and we were going to crowdfund it. And then the city and the foundation actually provided the capital to this small local food store. And what happened was that because there was no community capital, there was no real community buy in. The store was created, but the store wasn't sustainable because the people didn't have any buy in the community. And so I think the community capital is about the various types of capital, right? Some of that social capital, right? That I have a buy into this, that I have ownership in this, that I am proud that I was a part of this. Even if I didn't potentially put dollars into this, I was at the table when the planning was made. And I think that's very important for community capital. And the capital that comes in from the outside, that capital needs to be run parallel with the capital that is raised in the community. Um, so, I think that's absolutely where you need to start to answer that question, in very specific terms from a crowdfunding approach. Also, I think that when you create businesses from the community capital approach and you're looking at creating impact in the community, there needs to be a strategy. There needs to be a plan. If you just do one-off businesses, maybe they survive, maybe they don't survive. But if people have an opportunity to see the bigger vision of what this looks like, as a for instance, Carl, one of our partners, he calls this the integrated version of community capital. And one of the things that we talk about is going to commercial corridors, rehabbing those buildings, and then helping to fund the businesses that go into the commercial corridor buildings, and then creating affordable housing, so that people who work at those businesses potentially, or people in the community, can actually live in those homes with the goal of being able to purchase them at some point in the future. And what that strategic planning does is it allows everything to kind of layer on top of itself, and you're not just doing these one-off deals that don't have any relationship to the next deal that you do. So I think when we talk about community capital, it's important that we understand the different types of capital that go into making a community capital project.
So going back to the Memphis situation, and in previous conversations, you had talked about how that could be a good hub and what your organization and perhaps Cummings would help invest in. What are the, I guess, obstacles for her to knock this thing out that truly will impact the community, preserve history, again, create more of a sense of community, which is incredibly important. Sounds like there's an arts component there. And in my experience, arts is one thing that really brings all diversity, culture and diversity together. What does she need to knock that out? And will she be able
Well,
to do that in this time? In terms of
great question. Wow. Okay. Let me just be straight to the point and frank about the problem, which is anti-Black racism. And what that looks like is that the fact that most of the capital, if not all, has been raised from outside of Memphis. The Memphis foundations don't want to touch it, despite the fact that the overarching vision is to acquire these cultural sites. She recently acquired Aretha Franklin's birth home, for instance. These cultural sites in Memphis and South Memphis, there are so many of them. There's the Ida B. Wells former office and home, I believe. So there's all of these cultural sites that are usually in some of the more depressed communities in Memphis. Redeveloping them, telling the story about these sites, and re-engaging the whole community in grappling with some tough questions around race and class in Memphis and the nation. Now, she's been able to acquire the funds to redevelop Claiborne Temple, to acquire the Aretha Franklin birthplace, and to lead this 23-member community group to re-envision the community. But she's had some pushback from the local philanthropic entities who are frankly uncomfortable and who are frankly okay with the status quo. And perhaps, and this is just me speaking, I can't speak to this concretely, but I think there's an element of developers who see the opportunities for gentrification because these communities are close to downtown. And they might see this kind of longer term, deep community informed approach to redevelopment as a bit of a threat or a barrier to their, economic interest. So yeah, in a nutshell, is the power and privilege dynamics based on anti-Black racism that I think prevents the whole community and some key and important stakeholders in places like Memphis to get on board with this initiative and to even propel the initiative and accelerate it faster. Now she has to go outside of the community. She has to try to connect and tap into more national philanthropic bodies to do work, which, in my opinion, should really be led by the local philanthropies in partnership with ANASA and the Big We Foundation. Did I answer your question? Because
so that's an addition. Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, you added another obstacle that isn't obvious to many of us, unfortunately, but the layer and degree of racism is always there in underserved communities that are changing, and also how do you stop gentrification from taking over all stuff? Very delicate kind of process. But particularly, I'm sure in the South, these are the obstacles are even more pronounced. What I was getting at is how many years was she working on putting the capital together, the pre-development money, and now that she's found the money to build it, then what happens after that? In other words, how do you maintain it? How do you have a operating structure and to pay for the best practices to keep that project viable and healthy and not regress in terms of, okay, the money's run out now that we built it, but there's no money to really operate it. So first of all, how many years, if you know, was she trying to put all this capital together to rebuild, a hub and a community, I guess, not shrine, but asset?
Yeah, well, let me kind of go a little bit
Do you know how long
deeper.
trying to put all the capital together?
Yes, and it's a good question because it kind of helps us to drill in on what I mean by anti-Black racism from a structural perspective. And I'm going to talk about ANASA, but I'm also going to talk about another project in Jackson that provides a good illustration. But going back to your question about how long it took for her to acquire the capital, the story is this, and I'm going to try not to butcher it, but I think back in the late teens or around 2018 or so, She was asked to come into Memphis. Her background is as a cultural worker, and she's worked in the entertainment industry. She's originally from New York. She's worked in the entertainment industry. And so she was invited to Memphis to put on a show that basically contextualized the story of Claiborne Temple. Now, the owner of the temple at the time,
Marc, you're breaking up.
they were behind all of this, but at some point, he decided to sell the temple, and a part of the sale of the temple was kind of like stopping the show. And so Anasa was like, "Wait a minute, I need to get ahead of this." And so, to make a long story short, she had a really tough time dealing with this person, and it was definitely some power dynamics related to race and sex that she had to deal with. She named how there were all of these barriers, and when she would go to the banks, people just could not believe that this person could pull this off. This Black woman could like pull off this pretty big redevelopment. And so that is sort of it took her, I think it was in 2020, with the pandemic, that her work accelerated. And I think a lot of that had to do with the racial reckoning we had in this country, and the sort of infusion of capital from national philanthropies as well as corporate bodies. I think that helped. As far as how do you sustain the project, a lot of it is based on collective businesses that sort of reinvest back into the community to maintain the sustainability alongside philanthropic support. But I wanted to, kind of contextualize what I mean, because sometimes when we talk about like racism, it seems kind of abstract, but what we're talking about are real barriers to funding and capital and access to capital. I'll use another example that's a little bit I think I can articulate a little bit more pointedly. Dr. Nashley Cephas in Jackson, Mississippi. Dr. Nashley overcame real barriers to accessing a STEM education. And that's a whole nother story. But to make a long story short, she was able to acquire some skills, do some, opportunities that wasn't afforded low income Black women from low income communities in Jackson. She overcame that. She went to Georgia Tech. She eventually ended up working at a tech startup. That startup was brought out. She had equity shares. She acquired a good amount of capital. She wanted to come back to Jackson and redevelop her community, which is also close to downtown, also a majority Black community that has been, economically deprived for decades. And so her vision was to create a $25 million tech district, starting with a maker's space. And that space exists now. It's called the Bean Path. This space is to provide the community with access to resources, creative resources to start to use technology to start businesses, et cetera, et cetera. The bigger vision was to acquire more properties and develop affordable housing, inclusive economic activities like collaboratives and collective businesses. Now, despite the fact that she had money in the bank, to use as collateral to buy these properties, despite the fact that she has a good credit profile, relatively wealthy, the banks in Jackson would not lend to her. And what she told me in our interview is that they just could not imagine this Black woman, leading this project, despite the fact that she had the collateral, despite the fact that she had already had a successful project. Eventually, she was able to acquire capital again from outside philanthropic donors around 2020, but also the city provided some funds. And so that's just, a bit of more context as to what I mean by systemic racism. You have these impactful, prolific entrepreneurs, doing all of this great work who just can't access capital because people just frankly, can't believe that Black people and particularly Black women in those instances are qualified, to lead these massive redevelopment projects.
That's been a universal issue for ever and ever. The question is, where there's enough coming together to really change that paradigm. For example, before the pandemic, impact financing and all that good stuff sounded good, but on paper, it was pretty much business as usual. But I think things did change after the pandemic. It's like society woke up and we really need to support and invest in communities. So I've seen a shift. There's a lot more impact investors out there. Foundations are beginning to think more entrepreneurially. The problem, though, is how does that new thinking or sources of capital find its way into the right projects in the community? And that's the disconnect that is a big focus of ours. Is one, we're pretty good at community redevelopment and raising capital from all sorts of sources. But even more importantly, we're plugged in, we're organizers, we want to help change communities, and we can help direct to the ones that you're referring to. The question I have is, as your organization, how do you kind of help bridge that gap now that capital is getting into these communities? Is one of your priorities to help kind of streamline that from foundations and other sources and make sure it gets right to the right kind of projects that doesn't take 10 years to kick off? So the question is,
well, I think Bill,
go ahead.
So you could go ahead and rephrase the question. Yeah,
the question
that might be helpful.
Foundations like yours or organizations like yours, I'm sorry, I keep using the foundation, are they beginning to understand that capital may be coming together, but really tying it into well thought out, viable projects on the ground, there's still that disconnect. And that's kind of the space that we're in, RCI community. So how do we bridge that with expertise, access to capital, but strong leadership and entrepreneur projects on the ground that change communities?
Yeah, I think so. Let me define one sort of a frame that we use for system change. The deepest level of system change is not just dealing with the systemic sort of issues at whether you're talking about the financial system or the educational system, but shifting paradigms and shifting mindsets is the deepest form of system change. And so I think, with that being said, I think a real barrier is really undervaluing the communities that have the solutions. And I think Bill alluded to that. And so me going to the South and having conversations with people was a part of trying to shift that power imbalance. So instead of us sitting in DC and New York and making decisions for people in the South, we said, hey, let's go and talk to the people and let's identify from their perspectives. There were three questions that we centered. It was what's needed, what's working, and who else should we speak to regarding racial, economic, and environmental justice in the South. From those three questions, we built out a mapping of over 200 organizations. And the participatory grant-making approach is really designed to help facilitate in a tangible way a shift not only in paradigm, but a shift in power, and really centering the wisdom and the lived experience of proximate leaders. And that's the way to go. Now, I also think, let me also digress a bit to kind of give you a sense of what I'm working on here in Baltimore. I'm a part of an initiative called Invest York Road. And this is an initiative that is designed to redevelop the York Road corridor from, I think, around 33rd Street all the way up into the county, in a way where the community can not only own the properties, but also, they're making decisions about how these properties are redeveloped. And so I'm saying all that to say that, as you all probably know, York Road sort of straddles what do you call it, the butterfly, where on the west side of York Road, we have these very affluent communities like Homeland. On the other side of York Road, you have some stable majority Black communities, but also some communities that are struggling. And so the real trick is, how do you create this power base that doesn't alienate, key stakeholders? Because yes, we do want to, center those who are most impacted by these issues, but we don't want to alienate those who are more affluent. But we also want to make sure that we're not bringing folks together in a way that perpetuates harmful power privilege dynamics. So I'm sorry. I feel like I can go on get in my bag. So let me stop there.
Yeah. No, that's fine because when you're doing this, and you're right, the paradigm has been broken for generations. Why do we keep using it? The problem, though, is shifting that paradigm, which I think is happening, and this is where our heart is. How do we help shift that? And of course, having capital, accessible capital, is one way to accelerate that. Uh, but how do we change things? And also, it's just not all about capital. It's organizing. It's community connection. It's authentic respect and appreciation for each other. And it's not going to happen short term. It's a real shift in mentality and collaboration. So again, part of what we're doing is how do we aggregate capital from all sorts of sources, match it up with our own organizing networks, and then tie it to communities that definitely want to rebuild, have the possibility to rebuild, regardless of all the outside limitations like prejudice, racism, and all the other things that prevent communities that can be healthier from becoming healthier. So, Bill is
Steve,
really
I
one.
think
Yeah.
I think there's like a slight disconnect there, and one of the reasons why I talk about disinvested communities is because if you
Hmm.
call them underserved, and I think Carl says this all the time. You think this happened accidentally, and it did not. It's disinvestment. I always tell people the story that the place I grew up in, Cincinnati, today it's all the University of Cincinnati. And but it was a different community when I was there, not because the ground's different, not because the earth is different, but because the investment dollars were different. And I think that sometimes we talk about these things as though they're two completely different things, but they're the, I think, two sides of the same coin, right? And how do we get the disinvestment in there without the desire to move people out and to displace the people who are there? I'm looking at one of the comments from Pierre Clark, and he says, looking at communities and residents as assets and not liabilities, solutions to be activated instead of problems to be addressed. And I don't think I could have said that any better. And
Hmm.
as long as we continue to frame this and have this conversation like that, I think the way we're talking about it right now is we're not really talking about activating the people in the community, getting the people in the community to be a part of the solution, maybe having that community capital to, when you go to a foundation and you've raised community capital, you change that conversation. And now you're not asking them for money or investment, but you're saying, let's run our capital parallel to each other to invest
Hmm.
in these communities. And I think that language is really important when we think about, like disinvestment versus underserved. Running capital parallel to someone else's capital investment as opposed to getting investment from the outside. And I think that helps the mind change. And when we think about community capital, social capital is probably the most important type of capital. If you build that social capital, then the next logical step will be financial capital, because I have a relationship with you now. I trust you. I trust that we can do business. And I think that starting at the ground level and moving out, and as Pierre said, activating the people who are already in the community instead of expecting someone to come in from the outside, with these investments to help. I mean, they haven't. So why would I think they're going to do that today unless we organize in the community and then go to them and say, let's change this dynamic?
Can I build on that with a really good example? Because I really love that framing. The social capital piece is key, and that was one of the trends we identified when we did our tour in the South. And I want to amplify Tim Lampkin from Higher Purpose Co. Because what we define social capital as are the tangible benefits of network effects. And so what Tim Lampkin has done is he's coordinated a group of over 700 entrepreneurs, farmers, and artists in the Mississippi Delta, both in Mississippi and Arkansas. And their collective approach to supporting each other has collectively de risked their businesses. And so what Tim and the Higher Purpose Co was able to do because of that de-risking of businesses through these, through the tangible benefits of these social networks, tangible benefits being vendor referrals, just doing business with each other, et cetera, has attracted over 1.5 million in flexible capital from, philanthropies and even the private sector. And so social capital is real. And again, we saw this throughout the South, even when we're talking about Anasa's work. She's had struggles raising capital within the community, but a key part of her approach is all of the redevelopment is led by a local 23-member board. So it's not like she's making decisions on what happens with the capital, but the community is. And B, the sort of cultural play or strategy and a redevelopment strategy is alongside a supporting people strategy by providing them with training on what she calls restorative economics. This idea that, folks have, been left out. So now we have to restore. I kind of push back on that in my framing. I would call it reparative economics. So taking people who have been left out and giving them the tools and the resources to be included, which goes beyond capital. It goes, obviously it's training, but I think the bigger play there is to restore the value and how they see themselves and using these cultural anchors to tell that story of community and how they've always had the power, how they've always led. And because many times those stories are ignored or undertold, if that's even a thing. And so I'm really vibing with what Bill is saying and what Pierre put in the common field. And it's something, this sort of asset frame is also a part of what Trabian Shorters, he's an Ashoka fellow, has sort of framed. He calls it the asset frame. And he talks about telling, the stories of, not just looking at what's wrong with communities, which is the deficit frame, but leading communities or putting the communities in the driver's seat from an asset frame. And let me stop there.
So along those lines, then, Marc, what kind of ideas do you have to help bring these kind of collaborations together? So we're on the social enterprise, for profit, but with a very authentic social mission. How do we plug in, connect, and work with foundation or organizations like yours, Skull, and of course the community champions who are really trying to change their communities and maintain the legacy of those communities? How do we kind of merge these networks in an effective way?
Yeah, I think it's something Bill Drayton, who is our CEO, calls the revolutionary core. I'm going to use that language, although I don't think he would maybe frame it the way I'm about to frame it. But for me, that revolutionary core are people, or whether they reflect, local organizations or national organizations that already have adopted an equity lens or equity paradigm, meaning that they already understand an asset frame. They already understand, to what Bill was sharing, that these inequalities and inequities are not by happenstance. It's through structural inequality that includes uneven power privilege dynamics. And they're willing to do that personal work as an individual to unlearn and relearn, and really center and value those who are most proximate to these issues. I think it starts with that revolutionary core. So I don't think it should be an open invitation where everybody, at least not at the beginning, can come in and contribute. I think you have to be very careful about who's in the room, because if you're not careful, you would do nothing more than perpetuate harmful power privilege dynamics in a way that sort of puts like lipstick on a pig. Because now you have people who are addressing these issues who may feel, oh, I'm doing something progressive and I'm having the right conversations, when they're really just sort of masking a lot of inequality under being progressive. And so I think it's just important that everyone is aligned with the right mindset.
Well, we could spend a whole hour talking about what you just said in that last statement there. So that's for another time. But let me ask you then, how can organizations like ours that truly have a track record of a social impact, how do we plug in, connect with, organizations like yours? We're already very involved with community, and we're finding great opportunities, including in Baltimore. How do we kind of penetrate that wall that found, organizations or capital sources, DAFs and others have when it comes to working with social entrepreneurs like us?
Yeah, I think it starts with what you're doing right now, having these conversations and building relationships. Because it's, going back to social capital. It's the power of these network effects that can lead to tangible benefits is how we define social capital. And so I'm happy to, connect y'all to the folks that are in the field, because for us at a meta level, what we're grappling with as far as systems change is how do we propel the ownership economy, and the ownership economy for all, including, my sort of heart lies with those who descend from slavery, specifically because we were systematically locked out of ownership and we were literally assets. And so, in that context, it's important to sort of shift sort of the paradigm around, who's deserving of resources, who's deserving of ownership, and how do you equitably put ownership in their hands. And so, that's kind of the North Star for us. And so we have fellows like Molly Hemstreet, and she's in Western North Carolina. For some reason, I'm forgetting the name of the town, but she's leading the ownership economy that taps into the legacy of the textile industry in that area, and with a very deep equity lens, understanding the history and the culture of the textile industry and how people were excluded, specifically Black people. I've already mentioned Tim Lampkin, who's, through social capital, attracting more resources to support entrepreneurs in the Mississippi Delta. I could go on and on and on, but I think bringing those folks like that into the fold, although they're not based in Baltimore, just, bringing them in because they understand, how to do this right, and building relationships with them, equitable relationships, meaning it's reciprocal. And I think it's through those kind of interactions that then you start to attract the right capital partners, because, these it's all based on relationship. So, for instance, with our partnership with the Nathan Cummings Foundation, we understand that they are more or less a power player in philanthropy. They're also thinking about what other philanthropic partners we should bring on board. And so, we're like-minded, they're like-minded, and now I think we're at a place where we can start bringing in others through relationship that are aligned with, what needs to happen here, and who's able to put their money where their mouth is, to say, hey, like, we believe in equity, racial equity. Now here's money to, go toward a more equitable flow of investments.
So is it safe to say that you're building a infrastructure to help consolidate real capital that could be really adroit and used to really invest in worthy projects that sometimes takes years and a lot of burnt out players to put together? Is that something that you see as a trend and is happening, or are you already putting it all together and looking to change the paradigm a little bit?
Well, that's the North Star. The North Star is shifting the narrative about who's deserving of capital, why, and sort of saying, hey, like, if you're serious about this work, then you're not just going to talk about it, because, we saw in 2020 that a lot of organizations started talking about racial equity while they maintain inequitable systems. What we're saying is that, not only talk about it, but work with us to create more equitable flows of capital, more equitable systems. It isn't just including the flow of capital, but who's making key decisions, whose voices are being centered and valued in tangible ways, right? Not just saying, I hear you and I see you, but saying, I hear you and I see you, and here's the capital flow to prove that I, am behind you and your work. And it's also bringing others on board. And so what we're attempting to do here, to your point of building the infrastructure, what that looks like is shifting the system within philanthropy. On the 24th, I'm going to send y'all an invite if I haven't already. We're hosting a discussion. It will include the head of the CEO and president of the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Ray Ramsey, one of our fellows, Aisha Yandaro, Jessica Norwood from Runway Capital based in Mobile, Alabama, and Kim Davis, who is the senior advisor for the Walton Family Foundation in the Arkansas, Mississippi Delta region. We're going to have that conversation about what's working. So we're elevating those proximate leaders that's doing the work, but then what does philanthropy need to do to better support these leaders? So this is sort of our attempt to help shift the narrative and really amplify the role of philanthropy in changing the philanthropic flow of capital to the South.
Definitely want to mark that down in our calendars. So, Marc, we're coming to the end of the hour. It's been a very informative discussion, a lot of theory, a lot of possibilities. But let me leave with an example of something more concrete, and it happens to be something we're working on in your hometown of Baltimore. I'm from the D.C. area. Baltimore is my favorite cousin community. I grew up outside Philly, so I kind of have the Philly, D.C., Baltimore love affair. D.C., of course, is gentrified out pretty much. So Baltimore is there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of need, of course. We've identified a couple of very worthy projects that can create business incubators, arts communities, affordable housing, preferably co-op or home ownership or shared equity housing. So we're working in a couple of communities. We have tremendous community buy-in. Of course, the first thing we do is who is in the community that really should be the leaders of this. So we're working on this, and our deal is these are projects that we're finding that the community does want, can happen. Whether they pencil out or not, that's what we're working on. But at the end of the day, to put all this together, what's really missing is pre-development money, because to do something like this, where we could do literally, almost 100 new affordable homeowner units in changing areas, requires quite a bit of pre-development money. And that tends to be the toughest part. And without pre-development money, then nothing happens. So part of what we're looking to do is, if you're putting capital together, and part of our fund is to aggregate capital, including crowdfunding, and we're finding these projects on the ground with tremendous community buy-in and leadership, which is really critical. How do we tie all this together so that if you've got resources, we can help lead and introduce very viable, long-term, good, well thought out projects? How do we tie all that together? We're not going to answer this in the last 2 or 3 minutes we have here, but the idea is, going back to infrastructures, how do we connect the dots? How do we do this? And part of what we want to do in these two particular projects in these communities, and there's actually more, but these two particular, we want to do housing, everything else, including small business development. And part of our agenda is to help invest in these businesses that would be occupying the buildings, so they can ultimately own their business as well. And this is where Bill comes in, doing crowdfunding. We would want the local community to help contribute to these projects, but and crowdfunding is definitely one of the aspects. So again, we're bringing all these solutions together, trying to tie it all together, but it requires definite collaboration with players like yours that often don't need it or didn't need to, work closely with those of us on the ground to really streamline, to build all this out. So the point here is, do you see, and the last question I get is, do you see the institutional, the social enterprise community like that you represent working to really bring this together? And if so, are we getting there? Are we there? Or we're still putting it together? What can we do to accelerate really plugging all this in a more productive way that is an alternative to the status quo, which we know does not work?
Yeah, and I hope I didn't sound too abstract or too esoteric, but that's essentially what we're trying to do. But what we're saying is that in order to get there, there's a process of shifting, the way we think about how we support such redevelopment projects. So for instance, with the Nathan Cummings Foundation, they're very much, their next play is to invest $40 million in capital in the South. And so our partnership with them is around developing the ecosystem throughout the South. But a part of that is, understanding that $40 million is not going to, shore up the harm for some centuries. And you need other investments, and you also need the right paradigm. And so that's sort of the foundation. So anyway, I'm saying all of that to say, yes, we are seeking to build these ecosystems, but we're also, very careful to not, again, put lipstick on a pig and not kind of start with all of this like lofty rhetoric and not really address the underlying issue, which is how these communities are viewed, particularly by those who are empowered, those who have capital. And what I'll also say is sort of starting at a starting place here in Baltimore. Invest York Road is attempting to do a lot of the same thing. The investment in the corridor is based on crowdfunding where folks can contribute as little as $10 up to $5,000, but you must be a resident. And that will go alongside philanthropic capital to acquire properties and redevelop those properties, centering, what the community wants. So that's sort of one thing, we can go offline and connect on that point. And I've also mentioned a fellow that we have here, Bree Jones. She runs Parity, Parity, a great initiative for the ownership economy where she's redeveloping blocks, disinvested blocks in Baltimore. But basically, she's redeveloping those blocks by first pulling together resources from the community alongside, capital to go in and redevelop those blocks, but then allow the community members to move in as a community. And what that does is not only propels the ownership economy, but it builds community that will lead to long-term sustainability. So that's connect the dots here, and I know we're over time, so we can deepen the conversation offline maybe.
Bree is on our list. We want to talk to that woman. I know she's done really great work. Bill, you want to do the last word here, and then Mark, we can offline just to wrap things up, given our time.
Well, it's a great conversation, and I think that that Mark really brings the reality to the table. Is that those who live the problem own the solution, and if that's not true, then that power dynamic is not going to change. And you know, people being able and willing to see the truth about how situations really are is the only way we're going to get to the heart of real change. So I love what you've talked about today. I love what you bring to the table, and really looking forward to seeing how we can collaborate in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Apologies for running over, but Mark, it's been good talking with you, and congratulations on not only the work you're doing now, but the work that you and I originally met. So clearly, you bring a lot of really real world perspective to the work you're doing, and we hope that we can combine our strengths to make even greater outcomes and impact. So once again, Marc Carr, Ashoka. Look them up, check them out, and Mark, again, appreciate it, and we will continue the conversation. And by all means, we that want to check out your gig on the 24th. So we appreciate you, Mark. Bill, we will see you on the other side, and everyone have a good day, and don't forget to vote.